What would you do if you found yourself moments away from death with no way out? This is the story of one truck driver who faced the unimaginable, a horrifying crash, a desperate plea, and a mysterious handprint that changed everything. Imagine this. It's a late summer evening, the kind of night when the air feels heavy with the promise of rain. The world seems quiet save for the low rumble of a truck engine cutting through the stillness. A lone driver, weary from a long day's work, grips the steering wheel. His thoughts are distant, his failing marriage, his struggles to provide for his family, the weight of 1,000 worries pressing down on his shoulders. The rain begins to fall, first as a light drizzle, then as a relentless downpour. The road ahead, slick and glistening under the headlights, becomes a mirror of uncertainty. But the driver doesn't know what's waiting for him on that road. He doesn't know that tonight, the rules of logic, physics, and reason will bend in unimaginable ways. He doesn't know that his life is about to change forever. What would you do if you were moments away from disaster, with no way to stop it? This isn't just a story of a crash. It's the story of a choice, a fleeting moment of desperation, and a mark left behind that defies explanation. A mark that wasn't supposed to be there. Stay with us as we unravel the chilling events of that night. What happened to this truck driver wasn't just a near miss. It was an encounter with something far beyond the ordinary. And in the end, all that remained was a single, haunting handprint. If real-life stories that make you question reality are what you crave, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's uncover the mysteries that lurk in the shadows together. To the outside world, he was just another truck driver, a man going about his work trying to make a living. But behind the wheel of that truck sat someone weighed down by more than the cargo he was hauling. His marriage, once filled with love and promise, was now a shell of what it used to be. Nights were spent in separate rooms, conversations replaced by silence, and the unspoken truth hung heavy between them. This was the end of something that once felt unbreakable. At home, the weight of uncertainty loomed over him. His young son, still a toddler, was showing signs of something they didn't yet understand. The doctors had no answers, and every day brought more questions. Was it autism? Something else? He didn't know, and the not knowing gnawed at him. Then there was the job, the relentless grind of driving trucks for hours on end, day after day, hauling equipment across unforgiving roads, knowing it was just enough to scrape by. Dreams of something better, a life with less struggle, were fleeting. College was out of the question. A career change? Impossible with the bills piling up. All he could do was keep moving forward, one grueling shift at a time. It was a Friday, payday, a small glimmer of relief at the end of a week like so many before it. The skies were gray that morning, and by the afternoon, they opened up into a steady downpour. He had one last job to do, a favor for his foreman. The flatbed trailer was overloaded, but he didn't argue. He just wanted to finish the day, go home, and forget the world existed for a while. What harm could a few extra miles bring? That's what he told himself as he climbed into the cab of the truck. The rain came down harder as he eased the truck into gear, the weight of the equipment on the trailer already testing the limits of the vehicle. This wasn't just another Friday, it was the start of a nightmare, a journey that would take him to the edge of reason and leave a mark he would never forget. The rain poured relentlessly, blurring the world outside the windshield. The wipers moved frantically, but it was a losing battle against the storm. The truck's headlights barely managed to cut through the thick sheet of rain, illuminating only fragments of the road ahead. The air inside the cab was tense, heavy with the low hum of the engine and the driver's mounting unease. The descent began a long, steep hill he had driven many times before. But tonight it felt different. The road seemed slicker, The turn sharper, the stakes impossibly high. With every shift of the wheel, the overloaded flatbed trailer groaned under the strain, a constant reminder of how precarious this run truly was. Suddenly, the tires lost their grip. The truck shuddered violently as it began to slide. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, his heart pounding as the trailer swung out behind him, jackknifing across the slick road. He eased off the brakes, a desperate attempt to regain control, but the massive weight of the load defied him. The trailer swung dangerously close to oncoming traffic, the headlights of approaching cars flickering through the rain like distant warnings. Panic set in. He pumped the brakes, trying to slow the unstoppable momentum, but it was no use. The truck kept sliding, hurtling down the hill with a force he couldn't contain. The stopped traffic ahead loomed closer with every passing second, the red brake lights glowing ominously through the storm. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Disaster was inevitable. In that moment, he made a choice, a desperate, final choice. He turned the wheel sharply to the right, steering the truck away from the line of vehicles and into the woods. The headlights swung wildly, illuminating the dark, unyielding forest for a brief moment before plunging into chaos. The cab shook violently as the truck tore through the trees, the uneven terrain tossing him around like a rag doll. The sound of metal crunching against wood filled the air, each impact driving home the brutal reality of what was happening. This wasn't a decision to survive, it was a decision to save others, even if it meant sacrificing himself. He braced for the inevitable, knowing that this would likely be his final act. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The truck plowed into the forest like an unstoppable force, the cab shaking violently with every tree it struck. Branches scraped against the windows, clawing at the metal shell as if the forest itself was fighting back. The deafening roar of destruction filled the air, metal twisting, glass shattering, the engine screaming in protest. Inside the cab, it was chaos. The driver was thrown forward, then slammed back into his seat as the truck hit an uneven patch of ground. His head collided with the ceiling, splitting his scalp wide open, and blood began to pour down his face, blurring his vision. The control panel jabbed into his side, bruising his ribs with each violent jolt. He gripped the wheel tightly, but it offered no stability, no control, only a reminder of the chaos he was powerless to stop. Then, with a jarring crash, the truck came to an abrupt halt. The world around him seemed to go still, but inside, the pain was overwhelming. His chest burned with a pressure so intense it felt like something or someone was holding him down, forcing him to stay in place. It wasn't the seatbelt, he hadn't been able to fasten it earlier. This was something different, something unexplainable. For a moment, he thought his heart was failing, that the crushing weight in his chest was his body's last desperate cry for survival. But as quickly as it came, the pressure was gone, leaving him gasping for air. He opened his eyes, blood streaming into his vision, and realized the truck was no longer moving. The forest had claimed it, its massive frame wrapped in branches and debris. The cabin was crumpled, the dashboard cracked, but somehow he was still alive. He pushed the door open with trembling hands, stumbling out into the wreckage. His body screamed in protest with every step, his head throbbing from the blood loss. As he stood there soaked in rain and his own blood, he looked down and froze. His chest bruised, battered, and scrape bore a mark he couldn't comprehend. It was a handprint, deep and purple, stretching across his sternum as if someone had physically held him in place during the crash. But there was no one else in that cab. What he saw next would haunt him forever, a question he would never be able to answer. Who or what had saved him that night? As the rain eased into a faint drizzle, the driver leaned against the wrecked truck, his body trembling from shock and exhaustion. But it wasn't the wreckage that held his attention. It was the deep, purple mark stretching across his chest. It wasn't an ordinary bruise, the kind you'd expect after being tossed around like a rag doll. Nope, this was something else entirely. It was the unmistakable imprint of a giant hand, its fingers perfectly outlined, as though it had pressed down with unimaginable force. He traced the bruise with his shaking fingers, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The size of it was unreal, larger than any human hand he could imagine. The edges were sharp, precise, as if whatever had caused it had been deliberate. But how? He'd been alone in the cab, and no part of the truck could have left a mark like this. Confusion gave way to a creeping sense of unease as the implications began to sink in. How could something like this happen? Was it pure coincidence, a trick of the crash? Or was it something more? Divine intervention, a guardian spirit watching over him in his moment of need? Or could it have been something darker, something beyond comprehension? These questions circled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. The driver stood there in the silence, the mark on his chest a reminder of how close he had come to death, and how something, or someone, had pulled him back. As the sirens grew louder, he couldn't shake the feeling that the handprint was more than just a bruise. It was a message, a sign, or perhaps even a warning. Who or what had saved him that night? And why? The hospital was bright and sterile, a sharp contrast to the dark chaos of the forest. Paramedics had rushed him in, their faces tense as they assessed his injuries. Cuts, bruises, and a partially degloved scalp told the story of a man who shouldn't have survived. Yet, it wasn't the blood or the gashes that held their attention. It was the mark on his chest. Even the medics couldn't explain it. The deep, purple imprint of a hand spanned across his sternum, so precise it looked deliberate. They exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and confusion. "It doesn't make sense," one of them muttered under their breath. But they didn't press the issue. They focused instead on stabilizing him, though the image of that handprint lingered in their minds. Lying in his hospital bed, he replayed every second of the crash in his mind. The rain, the skidding tires, the split-second decision to steer into the woods. It all felt like a blur. Yet one moment stood out with startling clarity. The crushing pressure on his chest, the unmistakable sensation of being held down, as if by an unseen force. He stared at the ceiling, questions swirling in his mind. What had saved him, and why? Was it luck, fate, or something beyond human understanding? The mark on his chest was impossible to ignore, a constant reminder that there were forces at work he couldn't explain. Every logical explanation fell short, leaving him with only the eerie reality of that handprint. He looked at himself in the mirror, tracing the edges of the handprint with his fingers. It was fading now, but its presence was still undeniable. No answers came to him, only the weight of the unknown. Some questions, he realized, have no answers, and perhaps they're not meant to. But one thought refused to leave his mind. Someone or something had been there with him that night. As the days passed, the handprint slowly faded, its vivid outline dissolving into the ordinary bruises and scars of a man who had survived the impossible. Yet, even as it vanished, the memory of that night lingered, a haunting reminder of the unknown forces that had intervened. Was it a benevolent spirit, a guardian angel reaching out in his moment of need? Or was it something far more mysterious, something we can't begin to understand? We may never know the truth, but one thing is certain: the unseen forces that surround us are more powerful than we could ever imagine. Sometimes they act in ways that defy reason, leaving us with questions that may never be answered. What do you think saved the truck driver that night? Was it fate, luck, or something beyond our understanding? Share your theories in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if stories of the unknown captivate you, don't forget to like this video and hit the subscribe button for more chilling tales of the unexplainable. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that makes you question the world around you. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.